Okay. All right. To discuss Parshas Parah. We've discussed it many times in the past, but I have a new approach. Not that it contradicts the previous approaches that I have suggested, and I will discuss it. But first, I want to discuss the significance of Parshas Parah, and I have discussed that in the past also. There are some additions that I want to add to it today. The opinion of the Tosfos Harashon Brachos, and it's also brought in the Tosfos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid on Maseches Brachos, that there are two kriyos, two readings of the Torah that are mitzvah d'oraisa, that are biblical requirements. One is Parshas Amalek, Zachareis Asher L'Solach Amalek, what we read 2 Shabbosos ago, the Shabbos before Purim. And then the opinion of a minority of the Rishonim, of the early commentators, is that also the reading of Parshas Parah is a mitzvah d'oraisa. A matter of fact, the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Reish Pei Hey says that people who live in the faraway places, in communities that there is no minyan, should make efforts on Parshas Zachor and Parshas Parah to be for Shabbos in an area where there is a shul, to enable them to hear that parsha, because there are opinions that the hearing of these two parshios are not just rabbinic but are biblical. So, but the majority, while many understand the opinion that Parshas Zachor, reading Parshas Zachor, is a mitzvah d'oraisa, is a biblical mitzvah, most of the Mefarshim commentators say that they do not understand the opinion that Parshas Parah is a mitzvah d'oraisa. Parshas Zachor is a mitzvah d'oraisa, perhaps because it says Zachareis Asher L'Solach Amalek. Remember, and our sages tell us Zachor b'peh. It has to be an oral remembrance. It's not enough to remember in your mind. That's lo sishkach, do not forget. And also it says Ksov zo sikaron b'sefer v'sim be'azne Yoshua. Write this as something to remember b'sefer, in the book. To write it in the book is not enough. It's written in the book that it should be read from the book being the Sefer Torah. So there is a foundation, there is a basis for the assumption that Parshas Zachor, the reading about what Amalek did to the Jewish people, and perhaps the command to wage war at the appropriate time against Amalek, is a biblical mitzvah, a mitzvah d'oraisa. But the question is raised by everybody. What is the basis for the assumption by a minority of the commentators that Parshas Parah, that reading Parshas Parah is also a mitzvah d'oraisa, is also a biblical requirement? Now, what does Parshas Parah tell us about? Parshas Parah tells us about how a person who comes in contact with a dead body, or is in a room with a dead body, or under a roof with a dead body, becomes contaminated. And the Torah tells us about the process of tahara, the process of purification, that a person who comes in contact with the dead body, has to undergo before he can come in contact with Kodesh, before he can come in contact with holiness. And the holiness manifests itself in many things, but primarily it manifests itself in going to the Beis HaMikdash, in going to the temple area. That's why one has to be very careful not to go on the site of the Beis HaMikdash, even in contemporary times. Because according to the Rambam's opinion, that site, that space, retains its kedusha, retains its sanctity. And it's because not everybody knows exactly where to go, what to go. That the established custom of the Jewish people for generations has been not to go anywhere on the Temple Mount. In the same way as Ashkenazic Jews refrain from eating kitnius on Pesach, even though with many forms of kitnius, we could know and we do know that there isn't an ounce of chametz there. But since at one time kitnius was mixed with chametz, or it led people to eat chametz, or whatever it is, that custom was established. So the same is true here. Even those who claim, and it's certainly not based on any Masorah, that they know where it is, it shouldn't be any different than the custom of kitnius, which has established a prohibition of going on the Temple Mount. So Parshas Parah it tells us, but the process of the Tahara, the Kohen would take a red cow, and it would be slaughtered and it would be burnt. And these ashes would be used to sprinkle with living waters on the person who became contaminated. And then when the person would go into the mikveh, he would be, after being sprinkled twice, he would go to the mikveh, and he would become purified and would be able to go to the Beis HaMikdash, to the site of the Beis HaMikdash. It goes without saying today, we don't have the ashes of the parah. We have no way of purifying ourselves. And for this reason, one should refrain from going onto the site of the Beis HaMikdash. But this is basically what Parshas Parah is all about. It's about the laws of contamination, for coming in contact with the dead, and how to purify oneself through the making and the use of the ashes of the parah, of the cow, of the red cow, and which was sprinkled on the person before he went to the mikveh. But there is no doubt that that's a mitzvah d'oraisa. There's so many psukim are written about it. But where do we see a mitzvah? Where do we see a mitzvah to read this parsha? And I think that the mitzvah is implicit in the words of the Torah, because it says, "Zos chukas Torah." This is the decree of the Torah. Asher tziva Hashem lemor, that God commanded, saying, this is the decree of the Torah which Hashem commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel. Now, the more proper way would have been to say, God spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the people of Israel. Zos chukas Torah. This is the command of the Torah. But the Torah says, this is the command of the Torah. Talk to the Jewish people. So in other words, teaching the Jewish people, saying over this parsha, could be interpreted as being part of the mitzvah Parah Aduma, part of the command. Now the question is, how often is this command? Well, we could say a number of things. There are a number of possibilities. One is that it's a command, the biblical command is whenever they were sorry for Parah, whenever they made the ashes, there's a dispute how many times they were sorry for Parah, they burnt the slaughtered cow in order to have the ashes for the purification process. But whatever it is, there is a mitzvah. So whenever they would do it, it could be there was a requirement of the Jewish people to hear the parsha of the Torah. And that's implied in Daber al bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. Alternatively, we could say that, and according to this explanation, it would follow that today, that we're not sorry for the Parah, that we are not in a position to make the Efer Parah, to make the ashes of the Parah, so there wouldn't really be a biblical mitzvah. But we could say that even though the reading is a rabbinic mitzvah, but it's a rabbinic mitzvah that is based, that has its foundation in a biblical mitzvah, and consequently has some of the stringencies of a biblical mitzvah. But we could also suggest that perhaps Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, was a command to read the Parsha Parah to the Jewish people, to the multitudes of the Jewish people, whenever Bezdin sensed that it was necessary. In other words, when they felt there was a need to warn the Jewish people that before you come in contact with holiness, before you go to the Beis HaMikdash, before you bring your karbanos, you bring your sacrifices, you have to read this parsha. And the Bezdin, probably the Bezdin Hagadol, would determine how often that should be. And ultimately, that was decreed to be once a year before Nisan, as the Jewish people are getting ready to give the Karban Pesach. And that takana applied. And we could even suggest, but this is a step further. We don't have to say it, but we could say, in a sense, it's part of our looking forward to Mashiach coming very soon. Looking forward to perhaps this year yet. We will have the opportunity to bring the Karban Pesach, to bring the Pesach sacrifice. And then we could suggest a third possibility, that this is a halacha, and that this is a halacha that Beis Din has to set up dates for the reading of this parsha in a manner that in its judgment, that the Jewish people will remember and not forget the laws of contamination as a result of coming in contact with the dead. And from that perspective, we could even say that even today, that law, that the reading of the parsha might be considered a mitzvah d'oraisa. Now, but the question is, and I've mentioned it before, but I think it's very important to repeat. The question is, why is it that Parshas Parah? And Parshas Parah is identified in the Torah as a chok, as the ultimate chok, as the ultimate command. The mitzvah that we are most incapable of understanding the reason for it. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, said, the wisest of all men, that he did not understand the reason for Parah. So, and the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan told his students that when they asked him, what's the reason for Parah? He says, that's why it's so skukas Torah. This is the command of the Torah. And Rashi brings down that, why does it say chukas Torah, the command of the Torah? Because this is the command that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination in man, and the Umos Olam and the nations of the world, Moninus Yisrael, they torture the Jewish people. They make believe that they want to understand. And the foolish among us think that they're really interested in understanding our faith, not realizing that they do this to torture us intellectually, to agonize us, as they did in the Middle Ages with all their debates, when the Jews were forced to participate. And they say, Matam, they make believe that today they can't force us to debate with them. But they make believe that they're really interested in studying, when their true purpose is something altogether different. So the Torah says, Zos chukas Torah. This is the command of the Torah. And perhaps that might be, as I've mentioned in the past, that might be one of the reasons why it's necessary to emphasize Parshas Parah by reading it from the Torah, because Parshas Parah, more than any other command, all the mitzvos are commands, and all the mitzvos of the Torah, we submit to God. But Parshas Parah emphasizes that point more than anything else. So to emphasize that we're doing it because it's a command from God, the making of the parah, the ashes of the parah, the use of the ashes of the parah, is associated, whether on a biblical level or on a rabbinic level, is associated with the reading of this parsha in the Torah. Now, but why is it that paraduma, which is a chok, which is a command, is associated with death? And the answer is, when it comes to tragedy, the first question that comes to mind, why? Why? And if we don't understand why, or we refuse to understand why, we get angry. We get bitter. We have to understand, even when we don't understand why, there's a limitation to the human mind. And there are many things that we cannot understand. But man in his arrogance very often thinks that if he can't understand why, then there was no reason for it. So because of that, when it comes to death, the Torah says chok, it's a command. People write all kinds of books. Why does bad things happen to good people? But very often we just can't understand. And your father would always say, that there are many things that take place, that when they take place, we are not capable of understanding. People write all kinds of books of why the Holocaust took place. And some of the reasons that are suggested are utter nonsense. But sometimes there are events that take place that when these events take place or shortly thereafter, we can't understand. Part of the reason is because we as Jews not only believe in a cause and effect relationship as all historians, that the past causes the future, but we believe that the future sometimes causes the past. So until we see that future that was the cause of the past event, it's difficult for us to understand why. Only after the events that God allowed to happen have passed, long past, then we can begin to understand. But as it's happening, when we see the face of these events that God allowed to happen, we will not be able to understand it. My father would always give the example of some paintings that sometimes to appreciate the painting, you can't stand right in front of the painting. You have to move back. And God is the artist of the world. And to understand the painting, the meaning of the painting, we have to move back. And only with the passage of time is a little bit revealed. So when it comes to death, death is associated with chok. Gzeirahi milfanai. It is a decree before me. don't focus in trying to understand why. The human mind is very limited. But my uncle would say, and I've mentioned this before, he says, on one hand, we say it's a chok, it's a command, and we're not allowed to try to understand why. So is chukas Torah. On the other hand, we find all kinds of mafarshim, all kinds of commentators, even in the time of the Rishonim, who say that even in the time of the Rishonim, who offer reasons. Rashi mentions in the name of Reb Moshe Darshan that the idea of the paraduma, our sages tell us that the paraduma is a kapara, is an atonement for the sin of the ego, for the sin of the golden calf. So Moshe Darshan says the paraduma, that's the mature cow, the mother cow. It has to clean up the mess that its child, its baby made. The Egel Hazav, the golden calf, that's the baby. But the question is, what does all that mean? Now, it's very interesting that at the end of Parshas Shoftim, the Torah discusses there about Egla Rufa. If a dead body was found near a particular town, and we don't know who killed the person, so there is a whole ceremony that has to take place. And the Torah tells us that 5 members of the Beis Din Hagadol of the High Court of Israel come out, and they determine next to which town was closest to where this body was found. And an egla, a heifer is, I guess, a young adult cow, whatever, is the neck is broken. The neck is broken. It's a whole ceremony. And the elders of the closest town come out and say, Yodeinu lo shafchu es hadam hazeh beinenu lo ra'inu. Our hands did not shed this blood and our eyes did not see. And Rashi mentions what our sages say in numerous places. Does anybody think that the elders of the town actually killed this person? But it says, we didn't see him. There's a discussion whether him is the murderer or the murdered party. Below Patrinuhu, we did not let him go without giving him food, without giving him something to drink, without accompanying him part of the way. If we did that, we would bear some responsibility. So what do they say? And they say, Kaper Lamcha Yisrael. So what is said? So what is said afterwards, that the Kohanim, they say Kaper Lamcha Yisrael. Actually, the Zkanim say Kaper Lamcha Yisrael, and the give atonement for the Jewish people. Tamcha Yisrael Asher Padisa, who you redeemed. And our sages say that when we say that Kapil Amcha Yisrael, we have reference to the Jewish people, both the living and the dead, Asher Padisa, even those who left Egypt. So in other words, we ask for atonement, not just for the Jews of this generation, but the Jews of previous generations. And not just for the Jews of previous generations, but even for the Jews who left Egypt. So the question is, why is there a special mention about the Jews who left Egypt, Asher Padisa? Why is there, because we found a dead body, someone who was murdered outside of town. Why is it that way? So I think now, and to a certain degree, and I mentioned it many times, and I heard from my father, this is part of the idea. We say on Yom Kippur, Avol anachnu v'avol seinu chatanu. We and our ancestors sinned. So in a sense, when we ask for atonement on Yom Kippur, we're not just asking atonement for ourselves, but we're asking atonement for our ancestors. Why is it important for us to ask for atonement for our ancestors? And what relevancy is our asking atonement for the sin of our ancestors? But the answer is because what our ancestors, now, there's no question that our ancestors, generation after generation, our ancestors were greater than us. As a general rule, each generation is somewhat less than the previous generation. That's not to say that later generations don't have traits, positive traits that the former generations didn't have. Yes, they did. We sometimes the later generations have certain traits, but overall, the former generations were more devoted to God. There was more mesiras nefesh, more sacrifice in what they did. Compare a person, let's talk about, I'm not talking now about those who are not observant today. Let's talk about the observant ones. And I'm not coming to criticize those of our generation, but just to talk about the reverence we should have for the Jews of the former generations. Do you know what it meant in those days to sit and learn Torah, whether it was in Kollel or it wasn't in Kollel? The sacrifices that had to be made. The meager amounts of money that the people had. The living conditions that they had. And today, I'm not, again, I'm not finding fault with it. But today, people who learn in Kollel, whatever it is, have many more sources of income than the Jews of former generations. We have to understand the Mesiras Nefesh that was involved. The ability to have Sfarim books. Everybody has a library. Many in those days, hundreds you brought down that in Volozhin originally, before the yeshiva was there. When Reb Chaim Volozhiner was born, shortly before he was born, I think there was one Shas in the whole city. It belonged to his parents, and the Shagas Aryeh was the rabbi of the town. And because the mother of Reb Chaim Volozhiner felt it was inappropriate that the Shagas Aryeh would have to come to their house every time he needed a Gemara from the Shas. So she arranged that that Shagas Aryeh should let somebody know, and she arranged to bring the Gemara to the Shagas Aryeh. And the Shagas Aryeh gave her a bracha, blessing, that as a result of her concern for him and for his learning Torah, she should have two sons that will be luminaries for the Jewish people. They didn't have Sfarim. The conditions that they learned. And not to talk about before there was a printing press. Do you know the hardship that was involved? And not to talk, we live in houses that are heated. Imagine how difficult it was to learn Torah in the cold houses of Europe, late at night, without electricity. We hear stories about people who didn't have even candles to light and would learn by the moonlight. So there's no question that the Jews of former generations were on a much higher level. And that's true also. I'm talking about the top of the ladder. But then even as you go down the rungs of the ladder, the Mesiras Nefesh of the average Jew, what they gave up and what they could have gained if they didn't remain loyal to Torah of those generations. But nevertheless, as great as they were, and they were much greater than we are, they also made mistakes. And the impact of those mistakes goes down generations. And that affected the way we think and what we do. So to a certain degree, their sin is somewhat attached to us. And our sin is somewhat attached to them. Kaper la'amcha Yisrael, hachayim v'hamesim. Atone, give atonement for the Jewish people, the living and the dead. Asher Padisa, who you redeemed, even Yotzei Mitzrayim. But why the Yotzei Mitzrayim? What is the significance of the Yotzei Mitzrayim? Those who left Egypt. And I think the significance of those who left Egypt is, and we find that after the Jewish people left Egypt, time and time again, they are rebelling. And even though they were enslaved, their children were killed, murdered. Time and time again, they talk about the glorious life, the food that they had in Egypt. How are we to understand it? Time and time again, they said it would have been better for us to stay in Egypt. But the answer is, I've mentioned it many times, it was the idea of transference. In other words, the Jewish people, as a result of their enslavement in Egypt, they had a certain bitterness. And when they were in Mara, below Yuchlu Lishtos Mayim Mimora Timorimheim. They weren't able to drink water from Mara because they were bitter. And the Medrash discusses, what does it mean they were bitter? One explanation, the simple explanation, the Jewish people were bitter. Excuse me, the waters were bitter. But the other explanation is the Jewish people were bitter. And both explanations are correct. Someone who is bitter, he's always looking for what to complain about. He's looking for something to be wrong. And if something is not wrong, in his eyes, it'll be wrong. Very often what happens is a transference takes place. We get upset with what Paro did to us. So we blame Moshe, Aaron, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu many times. Because Paro was the king. Paro was the leader. To a certain degree in Egypt, Paro was the god. And now Moshe is the leader. Aaron is the leader. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is God. And a transference takes place. And when everything becomes Moshe's fault and HaKadosh Baruch Hu's fault, it's removed, as I mentioned before in the Shiurim here, it's removed from Paro. So the Jewish people say, it might have been better if we stayed in Egypt. Things were much better over there. So the to a certain degree, but more than that, so some of the attitudes that we got from former generations, the bad attitudes, didn't come from the Avos. Where does it really come from? From the most part. For the most part, it comes from Egypt. Not only because of our bitterness, that's one thing, because of the bitterness we suffered in Egypt. But what very often happens when we're in Egypt, when we are slaves, and as slaves, we see ourselves as the lowest in the country. And we begin to look up at the other people. And we have a very bad self-perception. And we start idolizing those who oppress us. So internally, some of their traits become part of our traits, depending on our circumstances. In Parshas Parah, the Torah tells us that God told Moshe to tell Paro Melech Mitzrayim and tell the Jewish people to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And Mechilta says, okay, we understand telling Paro to let the Jewish people out of Egypt. What do you mean to tell the Jewish people to let the Jewish people out of Egypt? So tell them the laws of Eved Ivri, the Mechilta says, of a Hebrew slave, of a Hebrew servant. Why? Why at this point? Because if you were a slave in Egypt and you looked up to your oppressors and you leave Egypt, you will acquire some of their traits. When you acquire some of their traits, so just like they enslaved Jews, and you want to see yourself, you're now free. So oppressing Jews becomes identified with the freedom. And here's a Jewish slave, a Jewish servant, but to you he's a Jewish slave. You will do the same thing to him, what your oppressors did to you. So we have to be on guard, not to be like Egypt. And many in the Torah constantly says, "K'mais eretz Mitzrayim lo sasu." You have to be on guard, not to imitate the morality of Egypt. Because to a certain degree, when you were oppressed by Egypt, you looked up to the Egyptians. And then there's another thing, slaves. Slaves, to a certain degree, my uncle mentions it in one of his drushos, slaves, at a certain point, and this is a natural psychological phenomena, they begin to think only about themselves. Everything is from what their perspective of what's good for them. They begin to not care about anybody else. He gave examples that I don't want to mention over. But when there's desperation for life, continuous desperation, it's me against the other one. And to a certain sense, yes, the elders of the city. Why do we suspect the elders of the city? Because there might be this element of me against them. Me. That serval perspective that we have handed down from the generations of Egypt. So we didn't see him and didn't take care of him. We took care of everybody we saw. But nevertheless, you need a negla rufa. Nevertheless, you need a negla rufa. Why? Because someone was killed. I think it's more than just that. We didn't see. That could also be a sin. Of course, it's a much bigger sin if we saw and didn't take care? Maybe we should have seen. But that's the impact of Egypt on us. Our becoming like the Egyptians. That's the impact of our coming like the Egyptians and our being slaves in Egypt. Mistreating other Jews and being slaves. On one hand, it's being like the master, imitating the master, and the other hand, it's being like the slave, only be concerned about oneself. We didn't see. It's very interesting. It's well known. I have children that are autistic, and I was very much involved, I think almost from the very beginning, in trying to help children who with disabilities in organizing organizations, whatever it might be. Actually, my father was probably from the first. My father did it already in New York. He was very much involved. My father and my mother, I should mention, they were very much involved. They didn't have children that had these disabilities, but they were very, very concerned about it. I did have children, so I was involved. On a personal level, I was involved. And really, for the most part, at least initially, very few, there were individuals, but for the most part, people wouldn't talk. People just ignored us. It wasn't important. It wasn't important until they had children of that nature. It only became important. Now, lately, we find, okay, now all of a sudden, there's talk about it. Why is there talk about it? Because people find a funny thing. It's not only some of the very rich also have children like that. So all of a sudden it became a major issue. It was ignored for years. Why? They were concerned, in a sense, because the rabbis ignored it for many years until their major supporters found themselves in that same situation. And it's not just this, it's in many, many issues. It's only when their major supporters were involved, because then it affected them. They thought of it about from the perspective of themselves. So this is part of our inheritance of Egypt, of thinking of oneself, not being concerned about others. And I want to suggest that what is the idea behind Parah Adumah? The what of Parah Adumah? The reason, the why of Parah Adumah we'll never understand. But the what of Parah Adumah, we could understand. The what of Parah Adumah we could understand. The Parah, when you think about the Jewish people originally being in Egypt, how did they come to Egypt? Or how did they initially with Yosef? Yosef is the Mishnah Lamelech. The Jewish people had trouble even believing. Perach, they couldn't believe that they were being enslaved. They put themselves into slavery because of their devotion to the Egyptian civilization. Why was it that they because of the position of Yosef. How did Yosef reach this level? Because of the dream that Paro had. And what was the dream of Paro? The dream of Paro was of cows coming out of the Nile. 7 healthy cows and then 7 weak cows and swallowing them up. And the cow, this is both historical and biblical. The cow was one of the gods of Egypt. So the cow symbolized, and who were the ones that instigated? Who were the ones that instigated the Egel Hazov, the golden calf? Who was it? It was the Erev Rav. And who were the Erev Rav? My theory is that the Erev Rav were the groups of Egyptians that were associated with the Paros from the time of Yosef. I wouldn't say that they were friendly to the Jews, but in a sense, they shared some kind of past with the Jewish people. And the Egel, the red cow, the red calf, that represented that period of time when Yosef and the Jewish people were held in high honor in Egypt. Now, who took them out of Egypt? Moshe Rabbeinu took them out of Egypt. But then they thought that Moshe Rabbeinu died. And in a sense, their exodus from Egypt to a certain degree was negated. So the Egyptian psychology took over them. And wasn't necessarily they wanted to identify with their past of Egypt. But in identifying with their past of Egypt, they did not identify. They thought of Egypt in terms of the way Egypt was from the time of Yosef. And that was the symbol of the Egel Hazov. So what caused them to identify with that period of time? What caused them to identify with that period of time was their focusing on that period of time when things were good for them in Egypt. Because death, because they, in their mind, the Satan made it appear to them as Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu in their minds came down late from Har Sinai. So the Satan made it appear to them that Moshe Rabbeinu was dead. Sometimes when we encounter difficulties, so we begin to reinterpret history. And there is no difficulty. And we look at one period and ignore another period. And we start to believe in things that are the obvious truth of what really happened. This happens primarily in times of stress, in times of trouble. So the same mistake that the Jewish people made, when Moshe Rabbeinu did not return when they expected him to return, we are capable of making in our times of stress, in our times of trouble. And there is, so because of that, we, to a certain degree, we have to undergo that experience to remember the mistake that our ancestors made, that we shouldn't allow that mistake should flow, that that came to them from Egypt should come down to us. Because of that, we take the ashes, which is the destruction of that represents the good times, which actually led to bad times, and that's how we retire ourselves, and that's how we purify ourselves. We cannot let stress force us to reinterpret history. And I think that perhaps, of course, that's not the reason for Parah Aduma, but in a sense, this is the what we can learn from history. In other words, do not let stress and trouble, and we all have stress and trouble. And there isn't a human being that doesn't have stress and trouble. But we can't have stress and trouble led us to imagine that which isn't true. And we have to, the idea behind chok the chok is an act of vayidom Aaron. We have to accept, but we have to move forward. And this is the lesson of Parah Aduma when it comes out in this week in Parshas Shmini.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. Where was your uncle's drasha where he spoke about people to survive themselves, they ignore others?
He didn't say it that way. He said the slaves. I think it was in Rabbi David's book.
Okay.
On the Sedrus. He talks about the carbon Pesach being a carbon of the tzibor and of the yochid, because the slave only has a yochid. And the idea here is that it's a carbon tzibor. Everybody bring a carbon Pesach together with other people. I would add the idea of chabura, eating it together with others. He didn't mention that. So this is I think it was in Rabbi David's book.
Former Chief Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, his brother mentioned the fact that he had his little brother to take care of, gave him strength, and helped him move forward while he was in the concentration camp.
Okay, that's
the same idea, I think. I mean, it helped him from not only thinking about himself.
Oh, that's right. But even that is a great madrega, because there were people in the concentration camps, and I'm not blaming anybody. We shouldn't. But there were cases in the concentration camps where even relatives, the relationship with relatives, that, by the way, could be an understanding of the idea of that there is no yichus for an eved. An eved stands alone. Perhaps we could use that to explain that halacha, that there is no yichus for an eved. No pedigree for a slave.
It does not look like there are any other questions, so thank you very much. Everyone